All right, let's get into Andy. You wanted to talk about the ratios of players in the CFL. Let's talk about that.
Well, as you know, since we started this CFL podcast, we learn the CFL and we learn the Canadian game. And you, as an official in the Canadian game, I'm constantly learning about the game on our show. So something I hear all the time in the CFL is, little things like you're only as good as your Canadian players, and that guy's a ratio breaker and everything like that. And I never fully understood it. So I wanted to talk about that ratio because it comes into play with some of our other conversations and how these GMs have to try to manage these teams. So I know you guys have somewhat of a general sense of how this works, but I'm going to run you right through it. So each team can have a maximum of 44 players, including three players who shall be identified as quarterbacks. Okay, quarterbacks do not count. So the ratio immediately starts to apply to 41 players, not 44. Not more than 20 of the 41 players can be international players. So that means you have to have at least 21 national players or Canadians. I'm just going to use Canadians, all right?
Right.
Yeah.
On your team. Now, each team must, this is a kind of a tricky one here, but each team must establish a reserve roster of 2 players. These 2 players can be national or international. Sorry, that's not the tricky part. I'll get to the tricky part in a second, which is a designation thing. So each team can dress a 44-man active roster consisting of those 3 quarterbacks that don't count, like we said, a maximum of 20 international players, now 4 of which must be identified as designated internationals, and then 21 Canadians. Now, the 4 designated international players are players who can play on special teams or replace an international starter, but they cannot be on the starting lineup, okay? Of the 24 starters on the team, 12 on each side of the ball, obviously, a minimum of 7 starters have to be Canadians. So when that's applied to the starting roster of a team, it breaks down as follows. When you're using the minimum number of national players, there's 1 quarterback, 16 international players can be starters, and then 7 starting players have to be Canadians.
Right.
And then it goes on to kind of explain what it means to be a Canadian player or whatnot. I mean, let's not dig too far into that. But our buddy Ray Perkin, who's kind of our CFL insider, I was talking to him about the ratio too, because I just wanted like an understanding, like how do GMs use that to build their teams? What makes things tricky? What's the typical thing to do for Canadian players, especially where we don't see a lot of Canadian quarterbacks, but they don't count anyways, right?
Why don't the quarterbacks count?
I think it's just because if for whatever reason, I'm just throwing I want your opinion on this, Adam, but I think like it's hard to find a good Canadian quarterback that's going to be one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and if you do, that immediately allows you to put another international player on either your offense or defense, and that could potentially just break the system.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what you're thinking too?
Yeah.
So I was talking to Ray, and he was saying that offenses tend to be very Canadian heavy. The offensive line, a lot of times, is the majority Canadian players. I don't know if that's just because it's easier to find really good Canadians on the offensive line or whatnot, and there's not as much on defense. Now, there is this part of the ratio that I can't find exact information on, but there has to be some Canadians on the field at all times. I don't know what that number is, but apparently that's reviewed by video and everything.
Really?
The officials are supposed to be watching the game the entire time to make sure that the ratio is being upheld, and there's always at least 7 starters that are Canadians.
The officials,
like
the on-field officials?
Can't be the on-field.
Sorry, there's officials on the field, not the officials, capital O. And it's hard for them to keep track on the fly, but if they do and they catch a team not adhering to the rules during the game, it's a 25-yard penalty plus a fine.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
25 yards.
25-yard penalty. Now, I read about an instance where the Rough Riders were violating the rule, but it wasn't caught during the game. And like 3 weeks later, after reviewing video, they realized that it was happening, and they got the fine, but obviously couldn't get the penalty. So anyways, that's a little, again, Canadian players, you can only have 7 of them, but you have to have 7 of them, and Canadian players tend to get paid better just because they're harder to find, I guess, in higher demand if you can have a good Canadian player to help you with the ratio. So that was a learning experience for me to try to understand this stuff and figure out why it's such a premium to be able to have a good Canadian receiver, for instance, Ray.
I knew back in the day that you need to have 22 Canadians on your team, but I didn't know about all the specifics that you're mentioning here.
Yeah, so it's very like the GMs have to use this to juggle their roster, and I think it's kind of fascinating. I wouldn't mind the league going, in the direction of maybe requiring even more Canadian players, especially at least on the starting lineup. But I'm sure it's balanced out this way for a reason. So
what do you think about the draft then, when it comes to which team do you think drafted the most Canadian players?
I believe that only Canadian players are in the CFL draft. Am I wrong about that, Adam?
I'm going to be honest. I don't follow it as much as I should be in OS, but I mean, the kid that got drafted by Hamilton, was he Canadian?
Yeah, Canadian. Yeah. He was playing US.
I think you're right. It's all Canadian kids in the draft, and
only Canadian.
And then the American players end up in that negotiation list.
You got it, and they get brought up if things don't work out for them.
I'm pretty sure they can draft an NFL player
if he's considered a Canadian.
Yeah.
If he gets that Canadian designation. Yeah. If you want to fact check that, Jeannie, while we're going here, maybe. But I'm pretty sure that
I don't think I'm allowed to have my phone out.
No problem.
No, you can.
Don't worry about it. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I realized you had the computer there, but you're actually doing the sound and stuff for us.
That's why
I'm gonna fact check this. Yeah.
That makes sense, because that's why the Stampeders had corners for so long and never had to worry about the issue, because he was their running back in Cornish was Canadian, their fullback in Cote was Canadian, so they were set there.
They were set.
They never had to worry about it, and then they just drafted the beef on the offensive line and kept it going. So
I'm told Chris Jones in Saskatchewan, he typically builds his teams where it's practically an all international defense except one player. Like usually he'll have a Canadian safety or something like that, and then he just stacks his offense with Canadian players. But yeah, so I'm pretty sure the CFL draft, for you to be eligible for the draft, you have to be designated a national or a Canadian player. And that's why all the teams are fighting for the best of Canadian players, because they're so valuable, right?
Well,
you need them.